So this is gonna be kind of fun. I'm asking a question that I'm kind of hoping to answer today, which is how important are RAM timings when it comes to gaming? We like to talk about the mega transfers. It's all about the mega transfer, right? 6,000, 6,400, or CU DIMM's now doing 8,400, but nobody ever talks about the timings. So today we're gonna actually compare 3 identical RAM kits with different timings to see how it actually affects performance when it comes to games. The XG2736 and the XG2536 gaming monitors from Viewsonic feature 240Hz default refresh rates, 1 millisecond response time mode, and industry-leading 0.5 millisecond moving picture response time modes that are ideal for gamers demanding a competitive edge. Designed with eSports in mind, these XG monitors feature fully adjustable and low-profile footprint stand for optimal viewing distance that professional gamers demand. To learn more about the XG2736 1440p and XG2536 1080p competitive gaming panels from Viewsonic, follow the link in the description below. So like I said in the intro here, mega transfers is kind of king, but the reason why I'm doing this video is I'm kind of reminded when Steve and I were doing the RIP J's 2 cents series back with the 2080 Ti water-cooled, liquid nitrogen-cooled stuff. One of the ways that both of us figured out we could actually get a significant uplift in performance once we've maxed out our CPU and gone with the fastest mega transfer RAM that we can get was to actually tighten up the memory timings. Now, before we can actually talk about the performance impact, we kind of do a real quick crash course. I almost said cash course, which would have been a great memory joke, but I probably would have forgot it. Anyway, so when you look at a set of RAM, right, you'll see these numbers like CL36-36-36-96 1.35V. So obviously the 1.35 is referring to the volts to run that timing. Now, when we talk about Expo and XMP and the numbers that are on the packaging, that is almost it's pretty much guaranteed to always be an overclock to the RAM. Because you have your base speeds that the RAM will run at, and then you have your overclock, which is either kind of specified for Intel, which is XMP, and Expo, which is for AMD. It used to be called DOCP, but now it's just referred to as Expo and AM5. So if you see DOCP, that's what that is. That's like the AMD workable timings, but they weren't specifically tuned for AMD, which is what the Expo sort of denotes on the RAM itself. So the first number, the CL refers to actually the CAS latency. So when we talk about RAM timings, the CAS latency or CAS latency is the time it takes for the memory to respond to the CPU. So the CPU says, hey RAM, I need something. Right, because most of everything that you're doing in your CPU is being stored on system RAM, and then the CPU is accessing it as needed because that's much faster than going to the drive. So when the CPU is saying, hey, I need this, it's the amount of time it takes for the RAM itself to respond to the CPU. Now the second number refers to TRCD. So RAM modules use a grid-based design for addressing. So we've got columns and rows. And information is stored in these particular columns and rows. Think of a big Excel spreadsheet basically, and all of those columns and rows have data stored in them. So the second number here, the TRCD, actually measures the latency it takes by entering a new row and then beginning to access the columns within it. So you can basically think of it as the time it takes for RAM to get to the address. So that is the second number. So that's why in today's video, and that's where I'm gonna stop right there. The next two numbers, that's a deep dive into RAM timings, and I'll just confuse myself and confuse you even more. So we won't do that, but we'll talk about the first two numbers today because almost everybody stops at CAS latency. But I was curious, what happens if we actually start to take into account the TRCD? Now those are timings that we would adjust when we were doing XOC because we were actually pushing with SLI back then with liquid nitrogen world overclocking attempts. We were pushing the GPUs so hard and generating so much data and frames being thrown at the CPU that the amount of time it took the RAM to access the data was actually what was our bottleneck at that point. So we started getting to the point to where we could see significant uplift to not only our average FPS, but our CPU scores by increasing the RAM speed, but getting the tightest timings that we can get. So the 3 sets of RAM that I have right here that I wanted to test, they're all G.Skill FlareX specifically for AMD. It's funny, one of these kits, as you can see at the bottom, actually supports Intel. It's got XMP, but all the others are Expo. which I thought was really weird considering they're the exact same series of RAM. So it's the X5 DDR5. They're all 32 gigabyte kits, two 16 gigabyte sticks. They're all 6,000 megahertz, but the slowest RAM right here is CL36 TRCD48. We have a CL3636. That way we isolated that TRCD number to see what actually happens when we do back-to-back runs on our benchmarks to see what actually happens. And then we left the TRCD at 36 for the last set, but we were at CL28, which is actually the tightest timings that you can technically get right now for DDR5 like mainstream CPUs. So that's why the test today is really interesting to see if there's a tangible, measurable increase in performance to your GPU to see what happens when we go with faster RAM. So let's talk about the testing methodology real quick. I'm kind of excited. This is the first time I've gotten to run tests utilizing some very new methodologies and philosophies. I'm pretty sure by the time this goes live, you probably haven't seen the video with Steve and I yet. Timings and vacations and stuff with holiday season are weird, so I don't know when it's going live, but we'll see. Anyway, let's talk about some of the methodology real quick. Test bench behind me right here is our 9800X3D. It is running a 360 millimeter AIO at 100% fan speed. The CPU is locked at an overclock of 5.3 gigahertz. It is not fluctuating. All C states have been removed. It is just running 5.3 gigahertz all day, every day. No sort of boost table, no sort of power saving states, just running locked at that speed. Obviously the RAM kits are what we talked about here. And then our GPU is an RTX 4090 Founders Edition with MSI Afterburner, basically saving a profile to it with 100% fan speed. I lifted the power profile to an additional 33% power limit to make sure that we were not dealing with any sort of auto boosting or tables. It basically ran at a locked 2745 megahertz the entire time. And all the data was collected using Present Mod, which is actually a pretty new tool for us that we just got a whole training on, which is pretty powerful. It shows us all kinds of things, much more trustworthy and much more accurate than anything you'd get with like Hardware Info 64 or Fraps or MSI Afterburner. Those programs don't pull fast enough. Present Mod was actually designed by Tom A. Peterson, or TAP, formerly of NVIDIA, now at Intel, and it's now being designed and managed internally at Intel. It is a infinitely powerful tool for us to be using now, and I'm very excited to be using that. So the titles we used are Black Myth Wukong's benchmark tool, which is free, so you guys can download it yourself on Steam if you want to use it. And we used F1 2024. The reason for that test, it's a very high FPS test, so we have a hard to run title like Black Myth and an easier high FPS count, which would show us if there's a bottleneck in RAM. That's where it would really show up. And then we ran all three resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, 4K, 4 times. So it's an average of all 4 runs times the amount of time, the sets that we have, which is 3. So that's 2 times 3, or no, it's 2 times 4 times 3 times 3. So plenty of runs. My brain's a little fried. You're probably sick of hearing me talk. Let's get to the actual results. So looking at F1 2024 1080p high presets, there's pretty much no change across the board, which is surprising to me because we're talking an average of 469.3 FPS. That's a lot. Our 95th percentile, which means 95% of the frames drawn, or 386.5 FPS technically or faster. That's the average of the top 95%. And then our 99th percentile, which you guys would probably think of as 1% low, is at 364.5, 366.1, and 365.4. So all 3 RAM kits at 1080p really saw in F1 2024 no change whatsoever. Now, as we raise the resolution, essentially the same story. What you'll notice is that actually we got slightly better, within margin of error still, slightly better 99 percentile. I mean, 304.4, 302.7, and 308.3. Now you have to understand, we're talking hundreds of FPS here. All of these are within run variants. So this is not enough for us to say, hey, there's actually a real uplift in performance. Now you could say, yeah, the 3648 is running 379.9 average FPS. The 2836 is at 385.3. But the 3636 is actually on top if we're sorting by average FPS at 388.7. The problem is we're talking a difference of 3 FPS, less than 1%. So again, it's run variance. You have to throw this out and say there was really no change at those two resolutions when it comes to this RAM. So what does that mean for 4K? It's pretty much the identical story, except what I thought was really interesting about 4K. 3636 is on top again at 265.1 average, 264.7 though for 2836, again, essentially an identical run. The 95th percentile at 230.4 versus 230.7, again, identical, and 217.2 and 219.2 when it comes to the 99th percentile. But if you look at the 3648, we saw an uplift in both 99th and 95th percentile. So we went up from 200.6 to 219.2. So that's nearly a 10% uplift in performance on just the 99th percentile. When it comes to the 95th percentile, we jumped up from 211.4 to 230.7. So it was kind of backwards that in 4K, the faster RAM actually gave us an improvement in our 95th and 99th percentile, but didn't touch average FPS. I would have to do more deep diving to try and figure out why that is, but again, 4 runs averaged, that's what it came out to. And it's not like one of those runs was really low, which dragged it down. No, they were just that consistent run to run to run when we look at all 4 runs done at 4K with the 3648. So that's a little backwards from what I was expecting. I was expecting 1080p to be the one we would see that kind of uplift, because again, more information needing to be sent to the CPU faster because the GPU is drawing so many frames. That was the easy to run test. What happens if we take a look at Black Myth Wukong? 1080p, 2836 on top at 139.9 average FPS, 3636 at 139.8. So again, an identical run, but we did come up from 3648 of 134.4 to 139, right? So we're talking almost, about 4 FPS increase. 4 FPS is not gonna be noticeable at 140 FPS. So it's one of those things where, yes, it shows up on a chart, but you would never actually notice that if you're running the game. So going from 3648, the 99th percentile was 112.1, 3636, it was 117.7. So we saw a 5.6% 99th percentile increase. But we didn't see nearly that increase going from 3636 to 2836. It only came up to 19.1, so not even 1.5 FPS increase. So it's one of those, like, the biggest benefit right now is looking like, as long as you're not running a set of RAM that has a really slow TRCD number, which 48 would be, that so far is the thing that seems to be holding back that set of RAM. Not so much the cast timings being, or the cast latency pulling up the RAM, if that makes sense. That second number is actually having the biggest impact on us. If we go to 1440p, very similar story. The average FPS comes up from 106.3 to 109.9. That's outside of margin of error because that is 3 FPS at 106 FPS. So we're talking nearly 3%. And then we went from the 3636 to a 2836 at 110.1. So 0.2 FPS difference. Same thing if we look at the 95th percentile and 99th percentile. They're pretty much identical between 3636 and 2836. They're well within run variance. And then if we look at the 3648 though, we did go from a 92.5, 99th percentile up to a 95.8. Again, when those are the lowest frames and it's a difference of 3.3, you're not gonna notice that, you're just not. 96.7 up to a 100.4 when it comes to the 95th percentile. So not noticeable. Like this is not tangible, like visual difference in terms of FPS gain. One other thing we did on here too is I did basically a frame timing chart here. This was actually a fun one to do. So the purple line is actually our 28 by 36 RAM. And then the light blue line is our 36 by 48. So when you overlay the frame times, which means the amount of time in milliseconds it took to draw every single frame of the test, you can see there's more than 8,000 frames on this test. They overlay pretty similarly. There's a big spike a transient spike at the very start of the test when it comes to the 2836, but that was a single frame. That could have been something loading in the background right as the test started. But yeah, it's one of those things where if we consider the price difference between these 3 sets of RAM, it would be pretty easy to actually have some severe diminished returns when it comes to performance per dollar if you were to go, well, I want to go with the fastest RAM possible. Now this is only a sample size of 2, and by 2 I mean 2 titles. This is not able to be a definitive, oh my God, save your money, don't buy the fastest RAM possible. I'm sure that there are titles that this would be more beneficial. Probably titles where it hits the CPU a lot as well. So possibly titles like Cyberpunk 2077, maybe even something like Flight Sim, as it's having to, you know, fetch that data from the internet now when it does all of the real-time mapping and stuff. Or as Phil was just saying, any sort of simulation title, not just flying or driving, but like Civ or Sim, whatever they're doing these days. All right, so according to Newegg, the 3648 RAM at 6,000 megahertz, 32 gigabytes, 2 16 gig sticks, the same for all the 3 of these sets, is 85 bucks. The 3636 is $89. And then the 2836 is $120. It's actually not as expensive as I thought, considering G.Skill just came out with this RAM this summer. Ultra low latency at the 2836. Now, it's not like a ridiculous amount more, it's $31 more than the 3636. Probably not gonna make or break a person's budget when it comes to building the system. So here are some recommendations, I guess. It depends on what you're doing, obviously. This does not take into account any sort of RAM intensive workloads. And even then, like Premiere, Photoshop, they care about capacity. The speed of the RAM is a lot less important. It's more important for gaming than it is for something like the Adobe suite. But I'm sure there's people out there right now that utilize RAM in such a way that both mega transfers and timings are very important. The sweet spot here is the 3636, honestly, at the 89 bucks. That going from the 3648 to the 3636 really gave us the most noticeable on the chart increase. Again, from the slowest to the fastest on these 3 RAM samples, it was really indiscernible. If you were to just have a blind taste test and ask Phil, like, hey, which one do you think you're on? It would be impossible to tell the difference because run variance is the only difference that there is here in terms of anything on the chart, with the exception of some of those 95th and 99th percentile FPSs. But I think the 3636 actually did a lot better than I was expecting. You know, it's one of those things where you can get CL40, 42. You definitely want the CL number. I think the sweet spot truly is 36 when it comes to these. But again, this was a small sample size of just 2 games that I wanted to use to sort of get comfortable with doing some benchmarking and stuff with the new methodologies to allow me to kind of get comfortable with the new process, but also kind of investigate something that does require some more digging to really get to the bottom line of what scenario does it really make a huge difference. And that's where I need you guys to sound off in the comments below. Are you running a game that you know for a fact CAS latency is king? Probably, again, those simulation type games like Civilization and such like that just are really hitting the CPU alongside the GPU. But in this instance here, at least with something like F124, a game that is throwing a lot of frames per second, which in my mind, if it was gonna matter a lot for frames per second purposes, like the more frames per second, does the faster CAS latency really help? In this instance, not really. Not enough to even warrant the $31 difference. But if you're the kind of person that's like, I'm just gonna build the most badass rig I possibly can, you probably have 31 extra bucks you could spend to get the fast RAM. So our recommendation would still be probably to go around that 3636 price point. It's for $4 more. You saw that there was improvements over the 3648, so there's no reason to go with a TRCD number as low as 48. But start paying attention when you pick up your RAM. Don't just look at the 6,000 megahertz. You'd be surprised. You could pick up 6,000 megahertz today and get like 44, like CL44 TRCD 50. Like these exist because the earliest 6,000 plus RAM had looser timings to be stable. But as they get better at manufacturing the RAM and the NAND quality improves, they're able to get the timings tighter and tighter. So not all 6,000 megahertz RAM or any RAM with the number on the front is created equal just because it has that same number on the front. You gotta pay attention to the timings too if you really want to get into that nitty gritty of tuning your system. All right, like I asked, please sound off down below if you know of a title that absolutely would make full use of the 2836 RAM. But I think we're gonna leave that on the GPU test bench moving forward. There's no reason not to. Just another potential bottleneck that we know we're moving somewhere to the GPU, which is what we want on the GPU test bench. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Hope it's helped you learn something, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.